Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Today's webinar is on the subject of R2V3. We will be providing an overview of the changes, the key changes between R2 2013 and R2V3, and highlight some of the key features of the R2V3 standard. This won't be as detailed, and it can't be as detailed as a Siri training class, but we will go over the main changes, as I said, at a high level to give you an idea of what the transition process might entail, where to focus some of your energies as you prepare to transition as an organization, or how to prepare for your registration audit if you are obtaining certification for the first time. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. I have a brief agenda on this slide to show you what the webinar will cover today. We'll introduce a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do. We'll highlight some of the benefits of certification to a standard like R2V3. We'll cover the transition timeline information and different transition details you need to be aware of if you are currently certified to R2 2013. Then we'll spend the bulk of the time on the revision itself, the R2V3 standard, the key changes between R2V3 and its predecessor, and some of, as I said, those key features of the standard. I'll close the presentation with an overview of the certification process for anyone who is pursuing registration for the first time, and we'll save any questions until the very end. So feel free to type those in at any point in the question chat field, but I will save those for the end. Okay, so just really quickly, a little bit about PJR. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars in the world. We have clients who we have granted certification to around the world. This is not an all-inclusive list, but certainly gives an idea of our global presence. And as a registrar, we're accredited to grant certification to a variety of standards, including R2, and we are pursuing accreditation to R2V3. Benefits of certification to R2V3 include a commitment to responsible reuse and recycling of electronics and components, improvements to your organization's environmental health and safety performance, a framework for meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements, driving improvement or increases in management commitment and employee engagement, providing a competitive advantage or improving public image of the organization, potentially some financial benefits. In addition to improving public image, certain standards in certain areas may elicit, for example, a insurance premium reduction. Achieving strategic objectives and/or stakeholder requirements can be another benefit of certification to standards such as R2V3, and the ability to integrate the standard and the certification with other business management systems. For clients who are certified to R2 2013, we'll talk about the transition information. So the standard itself, R2V3, was published on July 1st of this year. You can find the standard on the new Siri website. I've included a hyperlink here, not that you can click on it as you view the webinar, but it's pretty short if you want to jot it down. The REC, which is an important document to the R2V3 standard that we'll talk more about as we go on, has also been published and can be found on the same website. Siri has also issued their transition plan. This is found in Advisory 22 and can be found on Siri's old website in their document library. That was only released early October. So we've been waiting for that to come out to understand exactly how clients will be expected to transition. The Code of Practices has also been revised and released, and that can be found on the new Siri website in their document library. Our understanding is that the R2 guidance document will also be revised, but we don't have a timeline for that yet. We also don't have information for additional training for auditors to be trained to R2V3, but stay tuned on that. The transition plan has built in time for the transition to be staggered. We have already had a, a good chunk of our auditors trained to R2V3, so we'll be ready to conduct audits to R2V3 in the new year to meet the transition plan requirements. As I mentioned, the transition plan has a staggered approach. This helps facilities have time to prepare for their transition, and it also helps avoid overloading the certification bodies like PJR. If there's just an overall deadline and everyone kind of waits till the last minute, then we have resource strains and we have a hard time meeting those deadlines and not having our clients' certifications lapse in the meantime. So by staggering it, it's supposed to kind of make it easier for everybody. As I mentioned, PGR is pursuing accreditation to R2V3, and we'll have to obtain accreditation before we can issue accredited certificates. That does not mean we need to wait to conduct audits until we are fully accredited. We'll have the process in place before that. PGR will continue to keep its clients up to date, partly through these webinars, but will also issue a transition plan now that CIRI has issued their transition plan for R2V3. And as I mentioned, keep an eye out for training information to continue to come out, additional training for certification body auditors, as well as training for internal auditors and consultants and clients and things like that should be released in the next couple of months for training dates in 2021. Okay. So I forgot to remove the word tentative on the beginning of this slide. This transition timeline has been confirmed now that Advisory 22 is released. So I'll make myself a note to revise that. Okay, so the timeline looks like this. For anyone pursuing certification for the first time to R2 2013, your audits need to be completed by the end of this year, your stage 1 and your stage 2 audit. Your stage 2 audit cannot get pushed until January of 2021. Otherwise, we cannot audit you to R2 2013. So keep that in mind. If you haven't already scheduled that audit, it's going to be pretty challenging for us to find adequate auditing resources to schedule that at this point in the year. Beginning January 1st of 2021, no new registration audits, meaning those stage 1 and those stage 2 audits, can be conducted to R2 2013. They all need to be to R2V3 starting January 1st. For companies who are already certified, your transition expectations are based on the expiration date of your certificate. So if you're already certified to R2 2013 and your certificate expires on or before December 31st of 2021, you will be able to be recertified to R2 2013 again if you meet all of the following requirements. So the recertification audit needs to be completed by January 1st of 2022. All findings from that recertification audit have to be fully closed and verified before we can issue a certificate, and the certificate will expire by June 30th of 2023, even if it would have expired after that to give you those full 3 years. That's when that R2 2013 certificate will expire because that's when that's CIRI's final transition deadline for R2V3. We'll come back to that in a minute. So if your certificate expires after December 31st of 2021, then you're going to have to transition at your next recert. So keep that in mind as far as your scheduling and your planning of that recertification activity. Clients can transition to R2V3 during any audit within their cycle. So if you want to transition early, you can absolutely do so. Just keep in mind that the transition audit is going to be equivalent to a recertification time-wise, because we need to audit all of the core requirements and all applicable process requirements found in R2V3, which we'll cover later. And this is based on the Advisory 22 R2V3 transition plan from CIRI, dictating that requirement. So again, just to reiterate, the final deadline for transition is June 30th of 2023. That means any and all remaining R2 2013 certificates will expire on that date. So if you haven't transitioned yet, you'll have a lapse in certification, potentially having to start all over depending on the timing, but make sure you keep an eye on that deadline as you prepare and schedule for your transition audit. On the next slide, I've put this into a timeline. Sometimes a visual representation is helpful. So we know that the standard has already been published, PGR's auditors have already been trained. We have a deadline of the end of this year for any new registration audits. Beginning January 1st of 2022, any expired certificates have to transition. So as I mentioned, if your certificate is expiring after December 31st of 2021, you need to transition at your recert. And the overall deadline is June 30th of 2023, where all R2 2013 certificates will become obsolete. If you haven't transitioned by then, your certificate will be withdrawn. Okay, so a little bit about why the standard was revised. A lot of reasons. Standards are revised for a lot of reasons. In this particular case, R2 2013 was revised to take into account various lessons learned by SERI, feedback from the R2 TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee, public comments, including customers, auditors, certification bodies alike, a lot of different sources. It was also revised to reflect the diversity of the industries covered by the standard, to reinforce effective implementation of standard requirements and to ensure that the intent of the standard is being achieved, to clarify language and any sources of confusion within the document, within the standard itself. And as I mentioned, in general, standards are revised for a variety of reasons, including making sure they are relevant to the market. They continue to be relevant to the market. They're compatible with other standards which might have been revised, or other management systems, to ensure ease of use, ease of implementation, inclusive coverage over a wide range of sectors, flexibility for application to organizations of different sizes, and to be unambiguous, so free of misunderstandings or easy to understand, as well as easy to translate, so that clients around the world can implement the requirements the same way and be meeting the intent of the standard across the board. So we'll talk about, at a high level, the key changes in R2v3 first, but it's important to reiterate that there have been no changes to the original intent of the R2 standard. The language has been clarified, provisions have been moved around and renamed and renumbered, there's new documents, there's a lot of changes, but the intent is the same. So one of the key changes in R2v3 is the division of the standard into core requirements and process requirements. I've included a screenshot of the table of contents so that if you haven't already taken a look at the standard, you can see what that looks like. The process requirements are technically found in the appendices, and we'll talk more about that later. In R2v3, there is a greater emphasis on reuse, an increase in prescriptive requirements or prescriptive details, especially regarding data security, testing, and repair processes. There is clarification of requirements which were not understood or were ineffectively implemented. There are changes to the order, grouping, and number of provisions. As I mentioned, as you can see by the screenshot, we don't have 13 provisions anymore. There are 10 in the core requirements and then the process requirements as well. So those 13 provisions have been reconfigured and restructured and can be found within those R2 core requirements. Another key change in R2v3 is the creation of an R2 equipment categorization document, also known as the REC. I alluded to this earlier, and we'll talk about the REC after we've gotten through the body of the standard at a high level. You'll see a lot of references to the REC throughout the standard. So the introduction section of the R2v3 standard contains no significant changes beyond the introduction of the R2 equipment categorization document, or the REC. So a copy can be found on Siri's new website, and it's to be used in conjunction with the standard. As I mentioned, there's a lot of references to the REC in the body of the standard. The idea is that the REC provides an outline of the requirements for evaluating electronic equipment and components, as well as categorizing those equipment or components based on their condition. The categories identified in the REC either need to be incorporated into the R2 facility's process and procedures, or be utilized via a cross-reference between these requirements and the R2 facility's existing categories. So you don't need to use the categories in the REC, but if you don't use them, you need to have a cross-reference that identifies how they relate to your way of categorizing them. So you do need to use it in some form or fashion. And we need to be able to audit it, audit the fact that you have something that aligns the two to show that you are utilizing it correctly. No significant changes to the auditability of related documents. As I mentioned, the Code of Practices has been released and the R2 guidance is expected at some point, although we don't have an exact timeline. R2 certificates will list the process requirements that apply to each R2 facility, along with any applicable allowances as defined by the R2 Code of Practices. So the R2 Code of Practices still defines what allowances are provided by Siri and how they're defined. And additionally, as I mentioned, the appendices contain those process requirements. All core requirements will apply to all organizations, but you only have to utilize the applicable process requirements based on your facility's operations, and we'll talk more about that later. But you will see that your R2 certificate will reflect any and all process requirements that are applied to your facility, just as it used to list any allowances that you had. There are a lot of new terms, revised definitions. I'm not going to take the time to go through them here, but I tried to highlight some of those changes. If you want to review those on your own time, I would highly recommend getting familiar with the terms and definitions. A lot of changes here. Core Requirement 1 focuses on scope. So the R2 audits and certifications need to include all of the items spelled out in this section. As I mentioned, all the core requirements will apply to all facilities. You also need to make sure you're including any external processes, activities, and locations under the control of the R2 facility and associated with its certification. You'll also include any applicable process requirements, as I had mentioned, based on the facility's scope. Services outside of the facility but still related to the facility's operations might include things like offsite collection, mobile data destruction, any services performed at a customer's site, etc. So if you haven't already thought about whether those things apply to you or included them within the scope, you'll need to do so. As I mentioned, the R2 certificate will reflect any applicable R2 process requirements. As always, it will also have the scope of certification, any applicable code of practice allowances, and it will also now reflect all legal names and legal entities associated with the certifiable activities operating at or in conjunction with the R2 facility. So those are right out of the R2 standard, the R2v3 standard, excuse me, and you'll see some changes to the paperwork that PJR requests before your transition audit or before your registration audit as a new client, as we're attempting to ascertain all of this information from you as we get ready to conduct your audits and create your contract and all of that stuff. R2 facilities will also be required to publicly communicate a current and ongoing list of all other locations that are not certified to R2, are owned and or operated by the R2 facility, and are used to manage used or end-of-life electronic equipment, components, or materials. So again, these will need to be factored in and supplied. Another change to the core requirement 1, an organization cannot have been identified by SERI within 24 months of certification in a list of those organizations found to have marketed the R2 certification deceptively or fraudulently, participated in illegal acts or activities, etc. So any of those circumstances will prevent certification for 2 years. Core requirement 2 is the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. No significant changes here. Again, the intent of the standard is unchanged, and you see that by the lack of significant changes to core requirement 2. R2 facilities are to evaluate and sort equipment, components, and materials per their policy and core requirement 6, and direct items for processing as practical for reuse, which is the first choice, materials recovery, which is the second choice, and finally disposal, which would be the last choice. So again, that hierarchy and this section is unchanged from the R2 2013 equivalent. Core requirement 3 is the EH&S management system section or provision. The standard recognizes ISO 45001, which is replacing OSAS 18001 as we near the end of that transition period for migrating from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001. In the meantime, both are interchangeable. This section requires a process to periodically evaluate exposures to hazardous substances. Examples include mercury, lead, beryllium, cadmium, PCBs, phosphor compounds, flame retardants, silica dust, and hexavalent chromium. Industrial hygiene monitoring program requirements for high-risk activities such as materials recovery are also identified within this section. Core requirement 3 specifies minimum accommodations and requirements for workers, such as sanitary facilities, and controls to prevent the consumption of food or drinks in areas which are not kept contaminant-free. Core requirement 4 covers legal and other requirements. Here you find requirements to document applicable legal requirements for export, transit, and/or import to demonstrate the legality of those international shipments. These apply to equipment, components, and materials transferred by the R2 facility directly, as well as R2 controlled streams, which is a new term in R2v3, including shipments made by downstream vendors to final disposition or the first R2 facility. Core requirement 4 requires prompt corrective action to address any compliance violations. And R2 facilities are required to notify their certification body if they receive a notice of violation that requires action or follow-up to the issuing agency within 30 days. So you'll need to report those to your certification body like PJR within 30 days of receiving that notice of violation. Core requirement 4 prohibits child and forced labor, essentially referring to circumstances where workers cannot leave at will or terminate employment if they wish to do so. Prison labor is also prohibited unless it meets specified requirements, including compensating beyond room and board and teaching skills that can be used to obtain employment upon release. It also specifies a non-discrimination policy with specified requirements and criteria to be included within that policy. So that's core requirement 4. Core requirement 5 focuses on tracking throughput. It requires a summary report be maintained for all transactions for both inbound and outbound materials controlled by the facility. And this applies to through physical possession, title, or other contractual agreement. Summary reports haven't been defined, but will likely require all inbound and outbound quantities within a defined reporting period. We may see some clarification on that in the R2 guidance. Core requirement 5 specifies required record contents, such as accuracy of dates, descriptiveness of the detailed descriptions required by the records for all inbound and outbound materials. Total inventories need to be maintained below the limits required to maintain conformity with applicable legal requirements, the R2's facilities closure plan, etc. So if your closure costs relate to an estimate of the inventory levels and you go beyond that, you might not have enough funds to cover the closure of the facility at that given time. So you need to maintain inventory levels below those maximums, for example. Core Requirement 5 also states that you cannot store R2 controlled streams or materials with a negative value for more than 1 year unless they meet certain exception criteria. Exceptions would include components which have been evaluated and inventoried per Appendix C test and repair, or where permissible, if items are stored beyond the time frame due to a lack of a response from the relevant governing authority for export, where the permit or authorization application was submitted within the appropriate time frame. So what this relates to is for export, if you have submitted the documentation to request permission to export those items and you haven't heard back from the governing authority yet, you can't export them without that approval, but you met the deadline for when to submit that request, then you can go beyond the year. That would satisfy that exemption. Core Requirement 6, Sorting, Categorization, and Processing. This section is significantly restructured. You see a lot of references to the REC document here, so the two go hand in hand to clarify the requirements of Core Requirement 6. This requires a documented process for evaluating, sorting, and categorizing controlled and processed materials with prescribed subjects to be included. So we're not going to go through all of these. These are from the standard. They're in the slides. But again, this is pretty prescriptive, and you'll need to closely review Core Requirement 6 as well as the R2 equipment categorization document to ensure that your process takes all of this into account and is documented to meet those defined requirements in order to have a successful transition audit. All materials are to be managed and processed as an R2 controlled stream unless they meet certain requirements, including no longer being an R2 controlled stream. It has to do with the testing, the source of the materials, whether the facility was R2 certified or not. So again, you're going to have to get pretty familiar with the requirements of Core Requirement 6. This is the heart of the standard in that ideally, that first choice in the hierarchy for Core Requirement 2 is that things be reused if possible, whenever possible. All equipment or components are to be evaluated for data with their corresponding status identified per the REC requirements. Data evaluations are to include any connected user accounts and services. Core Requirement 6 also requires that you control any equipment or components that may contain data per Core Requirement 7. Equipment or components not permitted to be reused, sold, or donated per the written and binding commercial agreements are still subject to the requirements of Core Requirement 7, as well as Appendix E, Materials Recovery. Identification requirements for equipment or components evaluated and found to be capable of reuse, as well as references to the applicable appendix requirements, can also be found in Core Requirement 6. It specifies requirements for electronics or components that are evaluated and categorized as an unrestricted stream per the REC, such as handling them separately from R2 controlled streams, being able to justify their classification, maintaining tracking records, including any reason for return. Those are just a couple examples of the specific requirements for that particular stream found in Core Requirement 6. This provision also specifies requirements for transferring functioning products. This is equipment or components that demonstrated functionality per the REC, such as identifying the REC or equivalent categories for functionality, data sanitization status, and cosmetic condition. having unique identifiers, verifying the shipment legality, packaging, return policy. All of this is spelled out within the standard. Physical labels are not necessarily required. There are other ways to satisfy this requirement. And there are no significant changes to the collectible and specialty electronics requirements in Core Requirement 6. Core Requirement 7, Data Security, requires a data sanitization plan be maintained with procedures to address subjects prescribed within the standard. So I've listed some examples here, but this is not an all-inclusive list. And again, you're going to review Core Requirement 7 in detail and possibly utilize CRE training for additional depth and detail. Requirements for a written data security policy can be found in Core Requirement 7 as well, including assigning a competent data protection representative. And I've kept that capitalized as it's a defined term and title, a role within the R2v3 standard. Risk of theft and unauthorized access needs to be considered within the R2 facilities security program as well. Core Requirement 7 requires levels of security permissions for controlled access relevant to the types of equipment received, the nature of data managed, any applicable legal and other requirements, etc., to be authorized by that same data protection representative we spoke about on the previous slide. This provision also requires you maintain written acknowledgments for those who are granted security authorization, addressing their individual responsibility to prevent the release of data, to report theft or data breaches, etc. Requires an incident response procedure for the investigation of potential or actual breaches of data and or security, as well as to ensure the notification of regulators, suppliers, interested parties as relevant. Core Requirement 7 also requires a defined process to demonstrate that the destruction processes are 100% effective. So those are some of the key changes with Core Requirement 7. Continuing on to this slide, devices may be shipped or transferred for data destruction to a downstream vendor per a written contract if they've been verified according to Appendix A, downstream recycling chain. And this is in instances where the sanitization or destruction is not being conducted by the R2 facility. So if you're not able to do it yourself, you may transfer it to a downstream vendor by meeting these requirements. At least annual internal data security and sanitization audits are required in order to validate the data sanitization processes, and these need to be performed by a competent and independent auditor, is the requirement in R2v3. You need to have a process for providing information to suppliers upon request, including any changed downstream vendors responsible for processing data-bearing equipment or components from that supplier, as well as any security breaches. Core Requirement 8, Focus Materials, includes requirements to demonstrate that the recycling chain's expertise, capacity, planned methods, and capabilities needed to process the focus materials meet the R2v3 requirements. It also requires a downstream recycling chain flowchart when the recycler is not the final point of processing. So again, you see references to Appendix A, which is the downstream recycling chain requirements, and to also include international movements through final disposition or the first R2 certified tier. So this is another change between R2 2013 and R2v3. There are some instances where getting to that first R2 certified tier is as far as you need to go. Alkaline batteries not containing mercury would be managed under Core Requirement 2 instead of as focus materials in Core Requirement 8, along with print cartridges. So this is a change in between those two standards. Even lead-free circuit boards are considered focus materials. Core Requirement 9 covers facility requirements. Indoor processing is required, except in instances where outdoor operations have been assessed for risk and release potentials have been controlled. Indoor storage and labeling requirements for R2 controlled streams, including indoor storage of all items for reuse, unless the items are intended for outdoor use. Appropriateness for insurance coverage, given the risk, size, and scope of operations, is required to be verified, including any changes in operation, changes in processing volumes, etc. The closure plan is to include the use of appropriate commercial businesses to manage any electronics under their control. Exceptions for the requirement to hold a financial instrument for closure costs in the event of abandonment have been introduced in R2v3, but in order to qualify for the exception, you need to meet all three of these requirements. If the total closure costs are less than $10,000 and the size of all buildings owned, leased, or used by the R2 facility is less than 1,000 square meters, and the R2 facility never accepts equipment or components containing mercury, CRT glass, lithium primary batteries, or polychlorinated biphenyls. So if you meet all three of those requirements, you are exempt from the requirement to hold a financial instrument. Core Requirement 10, transport, requires packaging for transportation per Requirement 7 and in compliance with Core Requirement 4 as applicable. If transporting data containing equipment or components, defined security measures are required to be implemented. Shipments are to be tracked as appropriate given the sensitivity of the data and any supplier requirements that may apply. Contracts need to be enforced with the transporter requiring the same, and to utilize further security and packaging controls such as obscuring the contents of the packages and averting access during transport. Core Requirement 10 also requires the accuracy of codes, descriptions, and declarations in compliance with any applicable regulatory requirements for shipping documents as well as labels. Okay, so Core Requirement 10 is the last core requirement in the process, in the core requirements. So again, we've got those 10 core requirements now, and the remainder of the requirements can be found in the appendices in the process requirements, which will be applied as relevant to the organization's scope. Section 2 begins the process requirements. And again, these are the appendices. So Appendix A covers the downstream recycling chain. It outlines the focus material plan and due diligence requirements, including the verification of import-export legality for international shipments. I need to just mute myself for 1 minute. Excuse me for the interruption. I do apologize. Hang on, I will be right back. Okay, I apologize for that. So again, Appendix A, the first R2 process requirement, covers downstream recycling chain requirements. Import-export compliance evidence must be in a language understood by both the recycler and the auditor. It requires the R2 facility track and demonstrate the complete downstream recycling chain for all R2 controlled streams to final disposition, or to register the managed portion of the downstream recycling chain with SERI. So those are the two options there. Appendix A also requires transparent communication regarding the recycling chain to suppliers. So submission to suppliers of recycling chain downstream vendors for that supplier's R2 controlled streams is required upon request and upon changes in downstream vendor. So prior to shipment, if there's a change in those downstream vendors, you need to notify the supplier, adhering to any confidentiality agreements if there are any. For an R2 certified downstream vendor, verification of a valid R2 certificate will satisfy the rest of the due diligence requirements. This includes ensuring the certificate is active or valid or both, confirming the scope of certification aligns with the processes being contracted, and inclusion of process requirements as applicable. So again, making sure that their certificate is valid and that they are capable of doing the work and processing the focus materials that you are essentially sending them to do on your behalf. For a non-R2 downstream vendor, there are no significant changes to due diligence requirements beyond updating the verbiage to reference the applicable sections and appendices to reflect all of the changes in R2v3 or the REC, except one key change would be the additional due diligence requirements are detailed in Appendix A 8D for instances where a downstream vendor is to perform data sanitization on the R2 facility's behalf. So beyond the due diligence requirements, when you are outsourcing data sanitization to a downstream vendor, there aren't really any changes to the due diligence requirements for a non-R2 downstream vendor. Appendix B covers data sanitization. It lists additions to be made to the data sanitization requirements of Core Requirement 7. There are traceability requirements for each data storage device, training and competency requirements, security controls are prescribed. There is in Appendix B a physical destruction methods table, a requirement for video recordings of physical destruction, and those are to be retained for at least 60 days. It specifies data sanitization software requirements and maintenance for the software, as well as criteria for a 5% sample size. So that's the minimum sample size that you have to be meeting to be verified as unrecoverable by a competent and independent party. So you'll have to determine what that means for your organization, who you want to have conduct that and make sure that they meet those requirements, a competent and independent party. Appendix B also requires prompt corrective action and appropriate handling of nonconforming product where sampling identifies issues. The data protection representative is to approve the devices for release subsequent to the required verifications. So we see that that term or that title again, data protection representative. Appendix C, test and repair. For the test and repair appendix, any R2 facilities certifying to this process requirement are required to maintain certification to a quality management system in addition to the EHS management system requirements that were already found in R2 2013. So if you are doing Appendix C, test and repair, you'll also need either ISO 9001 or RIOS to have that quality component as part of your management system. This is another key change between R2 2013 and R2v3. Appendix C requires a written R2 reuse plan with prescribed criteria to be included, including documented instructions, competency requirements, safety checks, investigation plans. There's a whole host of items to be included here. Items need to be processed within a year of receipt, or materials processed within a year of receipt, tested, repaired, and or refurbished, or components are to be evaluated and inventoried as repair parts. So this would be what they mean by processed. Test result records are to be maintained for all functions for each uniquely identified item. Appendix D covers specialty electronics reuse. R2 facilities certifying to Appendix D must also certify to Appendix C test and repair, which means you'll also need that quality management system. Details criteria and verifications required in lieu of testing if the R2 facility lacks the technical capability to test the equipment, including verifications from the prior user that the unit has no known defects, visual inspections, verifying unique identifier information accuracy, data sanitization where applicable. Those are just a couple examples of the requirements for meeting the specialty electronics requirements in Appendix D. Specialty electronics which fail these verifications are to have the reusable parts harvested per Appendix D and the remainder processed as an R2 controlled stream per Core Requirement 6. On the other hand, if they pass these verifications, they're to be categorized as verified specialty electronics per the REC and meet specified tracking, packaging, and labeling criteria. Verified specialty electronics for reuse can be stored indefinitely, provided they continue to have a positive resale value or reuse market. So as long as you can prove that that is the case, they don't have that 1-year requirement attached to them after they've been verified. Sale of verified specialty electronics is to be limited to a customer's request for a specific part number or unique identifier, and this needs to be corroborated on the sales receipt or record of sale. Must demonstrate that the customer accepts the terms in Appendix D4C, such as lack of testing, and will only sell directly to an end user, providing evidence upon request with a free return policy. So these are some of the criteria found in this appendix. Appendix E covers materials recovery. There are additional EHS requirements for an R2 facility performing materials recovery. Some examples are hazard and risk assessments performed and documented on a regular basis by a trained individual with specified minimum criteria in the appendix. The maintenance of appropriate controls for dismantling, appropriate pollution liability insurance, evaluation of the materials recovery processes, output streams per the REC and Core Requirement 6. Just a couple examples there. So if you're doing materials recovery, obviously you'll take a much closer look at Appendix E to come to understand what is required of you. The final appendix, the final process requirement is Appendix F, brokering. This applies to the sourcing and control of equipment, components, or materials delivered directly to a downstream vendor and ensuring all R2 requirements applicable to the R2 controlled streams are met. So just because the processing is being outsourced doesn't mean it's not still your responsibility to ensure the R2v3 requirements are being met on your behalf. Downstream vendors are to be included and managed per Appendix A. An R2 facility certifying to Appendix F also needs a quality management system such as ISO 9001 or RIOS. So that makes Appendix C, D, and F that require the quality management system, ISO 9001 or RIOS. The brokering R2 facility is responsible for providing evidence of conformance to Core Requirement 6, utilizing the REC and managing transport throughout the recycling chain for those R2 controlled streams, meeting the requirements of Core Requirement 10 for both data security and physical security through transport, Core Requirement 5 for tracking throughput conformance, and Core Requirement 10 packaging requirements as well. On the other hand, Core Requirements 3 and 9 are satisfied by this appendix or not required to be met aside from adhering to the requirements of Appendix F. Just like in the allowances for the Code of Practices, it tells you which clauses or which provisions are satisfied by the allowance and which are still required to be demonstrated. And that is if the R2 controlled streams never pass through the broker's facility. So keep those in mind if brokering is relevant to your organization. Okay, so this is a lot of information. We're getting close to the end of the webinar, tight on time. I'm going to go through the REC at a very high level. This is a very technical document, and again, this is not a formal CRE training. So I've included some screenshots just to get a little familiar with the REC. Specialty electronics post-processing. That I was just informed that my mic was not working. Hopefully it's working now. Okay, let's see where we left off here, assuming my microphone is working again. So again, you need to either use these same categories or have a cross-reference to show how your categories align with those of the REC. Okay, we should be good now. Sorry about all the technical difficulties today. Okay, so here is a screenshot of the table of contents here to give you an idea of how the REC is laid out. Not all categories will apply to all R2 facilities, and you only need to use those that are relevant. Just a note here that categories do not replace descriptions required for contracts, regulatory compliance, etc. The assigned status for these categories is to be accepted by another R2 facility. That is also part of the idea of this categorization system. So the REC contains information about the R2 processing categories, including the applicability of different items here. We're just going through this very briefly. At a very high level, there's a table for data sanitization status. After equipment has been sanitized, tested, and is functionally confirmed, it moves to the functioning product categories found in Table 4. So we have some functioning product categories. Table 3 houses the cosmetic categories. Looks like this. Table 4 has the functionality descriptions. Looks like this. Downstream controls do not apply to functioning equipment or components, just like in R2 2013. The specific equipment categorization section is blank in case Siri wants to use that in the future. And then there are some appendices with additional categories and details, linking functioning and cosmetic conditions, things like that. So as promised, the last thing we'll cover today is an overview, really briefly, of the certification process for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time. So if you haven't already done so, you'll want to download a copy of the standard itself. And I had included those hyperlinks and where you can find the standard earlier in my webinar. You'll need to establish environmental health and safety management system documentation to meet the R2v3 requirements of the standard, conduct any training, implement all those requirements, including having your internal audit, your compliance evaluation, and your management review. The management review should take place after the internal audit so that the outputs of the internal audit are an input to the management review. You'll need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct your audits. and you'll need to submit any pre-qualification information required. As you can tell by some of the earlier sections of the R2V3 standard, there's a lot to be verified by the CB with the other legal entities, the company names, the other locations, the scope, the operations that might be taking place outside of the physical location, all of that. So anything that is required by the CB, from the CB, to be submitted by the client is part of that pre-qualification information for the CB to verify the client's ability to obtain R2V3 certification on paper. The registration process consists of 2 audits, a stage 1 audit and a stage 2 audit, which I will go through on the next slide. After the stage 2, if there are any nonconformities, you'll need to resolve those before a certificate can be issued. Let's see what that looks like. Oops, sorry. As I said, the registration audit consists of 2 audits. The stage 1 is a documentation review to make sure the framework is in place to meet the requirements of the standard, not necessarily looking at the implementation or the effectiveness, just that documented framework to make sure you're ready to move to stage 2. Stage 2 is a full system audit, all the processes, all the shifts to get a good sampling of the implementation of those processes and the effectiveness of the management system to meet the requirements of the R2V3 standard. You can have nonconformities issued at a stage 2, which again would need to be resolved before a certificate issue a certificate could be issued. So that includes putting them through the corrective action process, having a correction, a root cause, a corrective action, having them be approved by your auditor, all that good stuff. So a certificate is good for 3 years. Once you finish your stage 2 audit, you've closed your nonconformities and you've been issued a certificate, you'll be put on a surveillance cycle. So the first 2 years of that 3-year cycle would be made up of surveillance audits. They can be annual or semi-annual based on your contract. And unlike the stage 2, they would be partial system audits. They would be shorter. Not necessarily all of the processes would be sampled, just enough to sample some key areas and get a sense for how the system is being maintained, that the organization continues to meet the requirements of the standard, as well as to continually improve. On the 3rd year of the cycle, the recertification audit would be very similar to the stage 2 audit, a full system audit that would result in hopefully the issuance of another certificate after any nonconformities have been resolved. And the 3-year cycle would continue from there. Okay, if you haven't already done so, please feel free to type in any questions that you have. And while we field questions, I'm just going to go to the last slide that has our contact information on it. So again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Stacy DeSantis is our EHS Program Manager, and we can both be contacted via email or the main PJR number, and the operator can put you through to our extensions. If you are a new client looking for a quote or to contract with a certification body to conduct your audits, I've also included the phone number for our sales department on this slide. They can help get you started, walk you through the paperwork, or get a sense of what you're looking at here. Okay, so I'm gonna see what questions we have. Okay, our first question is, how do you define who is a competent and independent auditor or party? So unless it's defined within the standard itself, I don't recall that being one of the definitions in the R2V3 standard, but we'd have to go back and look. I can do that really quickly. But again, unless it's defined within the standard, that means that you have to define what that means within your management system. So it depends on what section of the standard you're referring to, but it should be clear within your process, whether it's a procedure or a training matrix or however you manage the competencies. If it's not defined within the standard, you need to define it within your management system. Okay, this isn't an all-inclusive list of the defined terms, but I don't see it here. And as I said, I don't believe that's one of the terms defined within the standard, but I would certainly review the terms and definitions in the R2V3 standard. And if it's nowhere to be found, Footnotes of the standard can sometimes have more detail as well. If it's not defined within the standard, we would expect that you would define who is competent and independent, or how you verify that within your management system, and that's what we would audit against. We would audit against whether you're meeting the defined criteria that you've identified within your system and whether the outputs are effective. So same as internal auditing. If you have a management representative who's doing your internal audit, but they are meeting all of the competency requirements and the outputs of the internal audit are effective, meaning nonconformities are being identified, everything is thorough. If the standard doesn't have specific language that prevents it, then you would be meeting the requirements of the standard. So I would keep that guidance in mind. Again, SERI may come out with more detailed clarifications through the R2 guidance document or their training that they will offer. But without it being a defined term within the standard, that's what I would say. Thank you. Okay, the rest of the comments were about when my audio cut out, and I do apologize for that. I will hang out for another minute in case somebody is typing their question right now. But if there are no more questions, thank you for joining us today. If you've got your transition audit coming up early next year, good luck. And either way, good luck as you prepare your management system for your transition audit. Don't forget to reference the Advisory 22 transition plan from SERI, and good luck. We don't have any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you again for joining us today, and good luck with your transition. Oh, we got one more question. The slides and a recording of today's webinar, I did forget to mention, will be posted to PGR's website. We have a YouTube channel that will link from our website to a recording of the webinar, and then the slides will be updated as well. You can access both of those through PGR's website. Give it a day or two. I've given this webinar a couple times already, so give it a day or two for the most current contents to be uploaded, but you can access them through PGR's website. Thanks for asking. I did forget to mention that. All right. One more question. If we have a recert audit scheduled this year, can we go to R2V3 instead of a recert to the older version? That would be probably a question for your scheduler. I can't speak to the availability of our auditors and those who have completed the training. I know that our auditors have gone through the training. I also know that the exam was not posted until after the standard was published in July. So at this moment, I don't have access to who of our auditors are trained, approved, passed their exam, and ready to conduct those audits. There's also a lot that goes into transitioning our system just like yours. So we have to update our auditor guidance information. We have to update our training requirements, our audit report templates. So it would depend on when your audit is scheduled for and the auditor availability. I can't say whether we can accommodate that or not. I know that we will be ready to audit to the new standard in the new year, but you can certainly send me an email. I've got my contact information on the screen, or you can reach out to your scheduler to get a sense of whether that is possible. Okay? All right. That's it for the questions. You're welcome. So again, thank you for joining us. Good luck with your transition whenever that will be, and have a great day.